Well, thank you, Fernando. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation from Aproseed to be able to come and speak with you today. I did have an opportunity to speak at an Aproseed meeting 17 years ago when it was held in Mar del Plata. And so I've been absent, but IPNI has certainly been actively engaged through Fernando ever since we opened a program here 20 years ago. This is our 20th anniversary working here in Argentina, and we appreciate the partnership that we've always had with Aproseed. I was asked today to try and look forward in terms of crop nutrition, and I will attempt to do that by setting some background information about current situations in the world. I will then talk a little bit about potential fertilizer use going forward, and then really talk a little bit about the future and what we might expect going forward. So just to set the stage, if you look at global GDP, it is slowly recovering. We're starting to be on the upswing, and global growth this year is expected to reach 3.9%. And that is really because of greater growth in the EU, China, Japan, and the United States. If you look at where this growth is going to take place, in the developed world, the United States will lead with an average growth of about 2.9% over the next 4 to 5 years. As far as the developing world and in emerging markets, growth is forecast to be about 4.9% this year, and then to exceed 5% going forward up over the next 5 years. There's always a lot of uncertainty when they try and, when the IMF tries to predict future growth. We believe that interest rates are going to start to rise. That is because quantitative easing is going to start to end in the United States and Europe this year, and that's going to tighten credit conditions. It'll make it harder to borrow money. And then there's a lot of trade frictions happening in the world right now. I'm sure everybody here is aware of what's going on between the U.S. and China, and that has a great potential to impact soybean markets in the world. And then there's a lot of policies taking place, especially in some of the large fertilizer countries, fertilizer-using countries in the world. For example, in China, there is a zero growth policy, which is the government has put regulations on the amount of fertilizer that can, the increase in the fertilizer use in China through the year 2020. I'll say more about that in a few minutes. India has a policy to subsidize nitrogen, and the cheapest nitrogen in the world is available in India. And one of the problems that causes is unbalanced fertilization. They use far too much nitrogen rather than P and K. And so one of the practices they're implementing is to regulate the size of a fertilizer bag of urea. Instead of 50 kgs, it's now only going to be 45 kgs. And so that is quite interesting. And then in Europe, you have a lot of new regulations taking place affecting fertilizers, and there's one that's causing a lot of interest and concern in the global fertilizer industry, and that is regulating the cadmium content of rock phosphate and phosphate fertilizers at very low levels, which will make it difficult for the supply of the European farmer. And then the FAO is very interested in trying to increase fertilizer use efficiency, and they're looking at ways and means to do that. If you consider the crop conditions that we're facing in this coming year, the Global Agricultural Monitoring Services has sort of put their annual forecast out, and generally you're looking at mixed to favorable crop conditions in most of the world. You'll notice on this graphic that there's a lot of red appearing in Argentina and Brazil, where there's the potential for poorer conditions. And we're not sure what La Nina is going to do this year. It was forecast to have an impact. I don't know if that's going to actually develop or not, but crop conditions for the most part around the world are fairly favorable. Crop prices are starting to inch up. They're starting to recover a little bit, which is always good for all of us. And at the same time, Global cereal stocks have stopped rising, so they're starting to decline, and that means that the stocks-to-use ratio is also declining. So that is positive news for us. These things combined together tend to increase crop prices, which benefit everybody. If you look towards the next decade, the FAO and the OECD are forecasting that global demand for food is going to grow more slowly than it did in the previous decade. And much of this growth in the previous decade was for non-food sources, for biofuels and animal feed. Going forward, demand is going to be driven more by population growth, and consumption per capita is not expected to increase a lot, but there's going to be more people. So if you look at the actual cereal demand, since the year 2008, cereal demand increased by about 520 million metric tons. It totaled out at around 2.6 billion tons. And in the next decade, the FAO and the OECD is forecasting demand to grow about another 360 million tons. But the composition of that growth is changing. And if you look at the demand by crop, previous growth was really dominated by corn, largely due to the biofuel market. That is not expected to grow a lot. So as we look forward to the next decade, the next 10 years, the average demand for corn is only going to be about less than 50% of the future food demand. So that anytime you talk about corn, you're impacting fertilizer markets and you're impacting soybean markets around the world, because in the United States, corn and soybeans are grown together so much in rotation. The demand for feed is going to outpace the food demand because livestock production is going to continue to intensify. And that bodes well for countries that produce a lot of meat. And that's the case here in Asia. From a land use perspective, since 1960, global agricultural land use has increased only by about 10%. And all of that was pretty well before the year 1990. We haven't seen much growth since then. But pasture land is very important, and particularly it's concentrated in the Americas. About 25% of the world's pasture land is in the North and South America. Sub-Saharan Africa has about 21% of the world's pasture land, and South and East Asia have 17%. And so, interestingly, the Americas and Southeast Asia also lead in global meat output, or global meat production. They produce 60% of the world's meat. So pastures are important. If you just look at actual meat production itself, and on this graphic, these blue circles represent the year 2027. The white circles represent a base year of 2015 to 2017. And what this graph is showing is that global production of meat is expected to increase in the Americas and in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, but not much changes in many other places in the world. And so the forecast is that beef production will increase by 16% and sheep production by 21% over the next 10 years. And if you look at the trends in maize yields during that same period, in conjunction with the area that is harvested around the world, you can see that, first of all, that half of the global cropland is really devoted to cereals and oilseeds. And the cropland is not expected to change very much. It's going to be fairly consistent. But production increases are going to come from increases in yield. And again, you see that happening in the Americas and South and Eastern Asia and Eastern Europe, a little bit in Sub-Saharan Africa, but not so much. Soybeans is a little different story in that we expect that land use will play a greater role in increasing soybean production. And a lot of that, of course, will happen here in Latin America, in Argentina and Brazil. So the big question is really, how much food do we need to produce in the future to sustain the world's population? 50% more or 100% more? There's been two highly cited estimates that give you different results. The first one was by some scientists that work with the FAO, where they estimated that we need to increase global energy food demand by 54% by the year 2050, relative to the base year of 2005 and 07. Another group of researchers out of the United States, heading up by a scientist named Tillman, estimated that global demand for calories needs to increase by 100% and protein by 110% relative to those same base years. And so what Tillman did is he used FAO data, and he took 100 countries and he tried to look at the relationship between the GDP and calorie demand. And he developed a graphic like this. He categorized the countries into 7 different categories, and you can see on this graph it's based on their color, based on how economically advanced they were. And you can see that the per capita GDP on the horizontal axis versus the per capita calorie demand on the vertical axis, it increases as people have more money. And that is not a surprise. The same thing applies to protein. When people have access to more funds, they include more protein in their diet. A group out of the Netherlands, headed up by a scientist named Go, expanded the Tillman work to 174 countries. So Tillman's work covered about 90% of the world's population. Go tried to include almost all of the world's population. And he predicted that food energy needs to increase by 34% from 2011 to 2030 and 75% to 2050. And when he looked at protein, he said a 40% increase by 2030 and 86%. So these estimates are higher than the work that FAO did, and they're a little bit lower than the Tillman study. And so I guess the point of all this is there's a lot of uncertainty in how we make these kind of predictions. And there's uncertainty is impacted by the number of people and their diets. A population is expected to grow by over 1 billion people in the next decade, reaching 8.6 billion in 2030 and then 9.8 in 2050. Half that growth is going to be in Africa. And so when you look at these uncertainties and how it impacts, it's impacted by urbanization and large cities. 2/3 of the world's population will live in cities by 2050. It's impacted by economic growth and cooperation, increasing inequality of wealth, political and social changes, and geopolitical dynamics which affect trade. Diet and demand is also impacted by the role and the power of the private versus the public sector. We're seeing a lot of changes taking place around the world where the private sector has a much greater influence in agriculture in terms of extension and providing information. And then science and technology is a big area. The depletion of our natural resources. There's concerns that the world is running out of rock phosphate and that we won't have enough to meet future demands. That is not true, but society perceives that. Climate change will impact everybody in the world. And then there's land and soil degradation, which is a big problem in Africa and certain areas. And that's one of the reasons why organizations like APRISEED are so effective, is because of what they do to soil quality and soil health when people practice zero tillage. And of course, government policies add to all of this. So if you look at the constraints to increasing food production, we look at our yield potential. It's determined by plant genetics, by photosynthesis, by solar radiation and temperature and carbon dioxide levels. The limiting factors to yield potential are really the soil that you have, the water that you have available, and the amount of nutrients that are available in the soil. But the actual yield that a farmer gets is really determined by yield-reducing factors, pesticides, insects, weeds, diseases, potential pollutants, or weather can all reduce, or it makes the actual yield that a farmer is capable of. Production is a complex system. I like this graphic because it demonstrates very nicely how that some of the factors we have no control over, such as the amount of light or temperature or the moisture, the rainfall that we get. But we can control various cultural practices, including the amount of fertilizer that we choose to apply, how we want to use our pesticides and herbicides, how we till, irrigation, and so forth. So all of these factors work together to ultimately determine what kind of a yield you can produce in a crop and how quality that crop is. So there's a lot of interest right now in trying to look at what is the yield potential, what is the difference between what farmers are producing and what the actual yield potential is. And this is called yield gaps. There's a wide range of yield gaps across the world. The yield gap tends to be much smaller in developed countries. So this is some work which was done by a group of scientists that headed up by Grassini as part of the Global Yield Gap Atlas. And I love this graph because it really demonstrates nicely that the yield gap in the United States is approximately 20%. There's an opportunity for yields to increase in the United States. Argentina, it's about 40%, 46% in Brazil, 50% in Indonesia, and 80% in sub-Saharan Africa. Now this is for rain-fed corn. So the average yield in sub-Saharan Africa is only about a ton to a ton and a half of corn per hectare, yet they have huge potential. So the question is, how do you deal with altering that yield gap? If you look a little more specifically here in Argentina, this is what the yield gaps have been estimated here in this country. You've got about a 1.2 ton per hectare yield gap in soybeans, almost 5 tons in corn, and 2 tons in wheat. So between 30 and 40% opportunity to increase your yields here. Anytime you increase yields, you're going to impact the amount of nutrients that are needed and that the crop removes. So my good colleague Fernando has gone through the exercise of estimating how much nutrients extra are going to be removed if we close the yield gap here in Argentina. So in terms of maize, simply by adding another 4.8 tons, which we believe is the potential, you would need another 230,000 tons of nitrogen removed by the crop. 46,000 tons of P, 60 of K, and 20 of sulfur. If you look at that in soybeans, the nitrogen levels are about the same, but you're going to remove another 100,000 tons of P, 360,000 tons of K. That's a huge deficit. Now you're blessed in much of Argentina where you have very rich K reserves in your soil. But that can't go on indefinitely. Sometime in some of your lifetimes, you're going to be seeing a need to use more potassium here in the pampas. You look at wheat, similar numbers. So if you add all of these numbers up, translate that in terms of fertilizer, this is equivalent to about 1.4 million tons of urea, 800,000 tons of MAP, or 900,000 tons of potash, and about 500,000 tons of calcium nitrate. So anytime you're talking about increasing your yield potential, any crop that you grow, anytime you plant a cover crop, that will remove nutrients from the soil, and they need to be replaced if you want to maintain your soil quality and maintain a healthy soil. So we know that food production, cereal production, is closely linked to fertilizer consumption. This is a very simple graph, but since the 1960s, when fertilizer use really started to take off around the world, it goes hand in hand with cereal production. About half of the world's cereals that are produced are attributed to the use of fertilizers. In other words, half the people on this planet wouldn't be here if we didn't use fertilizers. So that's very important. If you look at the individual nutrients, as I've shown on this graph, you can see that they've pretty well steadily increased. But there's a lot of regional differences. It's not the same everywhere. And so if you look at this graph in the upper left-hand corner in Asia, Asia has about 30% of the arable land in the world. They have 55% of the world's population, and they use over 50% of the world's nutrients. 50% of the world's fertilizer goes into Asia. And notice on these graphs that the vertical axis in Asia, we're showing numbers going up to 80 million tons, whereas in North America, Latin America, and West and Central Europe, it only goes up to 16 million tons. So there's regional differences. Generally in Europe, their fertilizer use is declining. In North America, it's fairly stable, but it's increasing in Latin America. So every year, the International Fertilizer Industry Association forecasts change in global fertilizer demand. And this is their forecast that just came out a couple of months ago. And it shows you the fertilizer years of 2016-17. So it's like a cropping season almost. It includes the fall and the spring of a year. And you can see in 2016-17 the total fertilizer demand increased by over 1%. Last year it was less than 1% at 0.9, and forecast for this coming fertilizer season it's only at 0.8%. If we were to exclude China from these numbers, last year there would have been over 2% increase in growth. And I say that because of this policy in China, this zero growth policy that has been implemented. They're targeting a zero growth in mineral fertilizers and pesticides by the year 2020 in order to mitigate environmental problems. So China uses among the highest rates of fertilizer in the world, and that's starting to catch up with them. Average fertilizer use in the world per hectare is about 175 kilograms per hectare. In China, it's over 300. And so that's causing potential problems for them, and they need to deal with that. So this year, this fertilizer season, global demand for fertilizer is expected to reach 189 million tons, but in the next 5 years, it will reach 200 million tons. So it is slowly increasing, but it's not increasing the same rate everywhere in the world. And this shows you the relative growth rates. So the fastest growing fertilizer market in the world is in Africa. Now keep in mind, they use very little amount of fertilizer, less than 10 kilograms per hectare. But it is increasing there and is forecast to continue to increase. Eastern Europe is also increasing very rapidly. I'm sure you're all aware that when the Soviet Union collapsed several years ago, fertilizer use in the Soviet Union and crop production really dived. It really decreased. That's starting to change now. They're starting to fertilize their crops better. You're going to see the Soviets in Russia producing and exporting more grain because they're doing a much better job of managing it. Latin America, there's always going to be hot growth here, and then South Asia, and then the rest of the world, you're not going to see as much growth in those markets. If you look at the change in application rates, this graph sort of summarizes that in East Asia, we're expecting application rates to decline. And on this axis, I've got a compound annual growth rate on a base year, which would be 2016-2017 for fertilizer. So you're going to see some increases in South Asia. Latin America, you're going to see some increases in Africa and Eastern Europe. So we are expecting some changes in application rates to take place in some areas. So just to summarize this section before I move on to a little different topic, from an economic perspective, we're seeing GDP is starting to recover, but finances, politics, trade can cloud the horizon as far as what we might expect. From an agriculture crop production perspective, cereal stocks are tightening, and that's going to bring crop prices up, and we're expecting production to continue to grow slowly with increases in yields rather than expansion of area. And from a policy perspective, environmental policies are tightening up in the developed world and in China, and fertilizer subsidies are being looked at and changed in South Asia, and there's also subsidies in sub-Saharan Africa, which play an important role. In terms of the demand for fertilizer, we think that China's use of fertilizer has plateaued, and it's probably going to start to flatten out, but it's certainly not going to increase going forward. Globally, we're only looking at a modest expansion in fertilizer use around the world, but in the next few years we're going to reach 200 million tons of nutrients with strong expansion outside of China. If you look towards 2030, we expect markets to decline in East Asia but grow in Latin America and Africa and in South Asia. And mainly in South Asia, we're talking about India. Okay? So let's switch gears a little bit and use a crystal ball and kind of look to the future. Every year, the World Economic Forum meets and they produce a global risk landscape map. And they try and ask the question, what is the impact and likelihood of global risks? And they plot it on a graph, and on this graph, on the vertical axis, you can see the impact of a risk, and on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, the likelihood of a risk happening. And so what they did for this most recent survey, they asked 1,000 experts from various multi-stakeholder communities to respond to a question about what they thought would the risks and what impact would they have, or what is the likelihood of them happening. And they identified 29 risks, and they grouped them according to societal, technological, economic, environmental, or geopolitical over a 10-year time span, and they were asked to rate each of these risks according to their perceived likelihood of them occurring and what impact it would have if they did occur. And so among the top 5 risks that were identified is food crisis, water crisis, extreme weather events, the failure of climate change mitigation. In other words, we're not going to be able to address the problem of climate change, and biodiversity crisis. So it's interesting that these 5, among their top 10, are all factors which impact us sitting in this room. And so that is what some of the world's experts think are risks that the planet and humanity faces. And we have a role to play in that. So the fertilizer industry is very interested in this. So the International Fertilizer Association, IFA, they have recently begun a long-range strategic planning process to try and get a feel for what they think the future might look like as far as they're concerned. And the way that they've approached this is to use scenario planning methodologies. So scenarios are alternative, plausible futures. They're not predictions of how the future would unfold. They're possible things that could happen. They consider what are the likely major milestones or events that could impact us. They try and address what are the most significant factors that will influence our environment and how they might play out. And finally, how does the industry need to adapt? How does it need to change in order to be prepared for the future? And what are the roles of the other stakeholders? So the process that they went through is they conducted a series of electronic surveys. They interviewed several hundred people within the industry and people outside of the industry. They put together an advisory panel of some of the world's leading agricultural experts, so largely academics, some government people, to get their opinion. And then they conducted a series of workshops internally within the fertilizer industry, involving people in all facets of the industry, ranging from the CEOs down to the people working in the plants or agronomists working in the field. They used a methodology which is termed steep analysis. And they posed the question, for the fertilizer industry, what are the issues that have the potential to bring about significant change or success up to the year 2030? So the steep analysis considers social, technological, environmental, economic, and policy aspects. So they were trying to group all of these things into those categories. So they held a series of meetings. They identified various stresses, constraints, regulatory processes, and so forth, which might impact natural resources that agriculture relies on. So that includes water, climate, soil, and then availability of raw materials for fertilizers. They tried to look at socio-demographic changes and pressures, population growth, how diets might change, consumer behavior on a global scale. And they looked at new technologies. Do they have the potential to accelerate or disrupt the potential in agriculture? And so as they went through this exercise, they did these surveys, these interviews, they brought in experts, they held workshops with two driving factors that they think are going to impact the future in the next 10 years. One is innovation. It's going to have a driving effect. And the second is just agricultural production growth. So if you look at these two drivers and put them on a scale, as far as innovation goes, you could have either weak innovation or strong innovation. And from an agricultural production growth, you could have very sluggish growth or very vigorous growth. And then they organized it on a schematic, something like this, so that you could put these things in quadrants. And so on the quadrant that is vertical, you've got agricultural production growth, and then on the horizontal quadrant, you've got innovation. And they came up with a name for each of these quadrants as to how they might group their activities. And so they felt in the lower right-hand quadrant of strong innovation but sluggish agricultural growth, they called that Ready, Set, Go. They called one of the quadrants New Horizons, one Commodity Classic, and one Reduced Dynamism. So as far as Ready, Set, Go in that particular quadrant, you've got lower agricultural growth driven by greater resource efficiency, reduced food waste, and breakthroughs in technology that could potentially lead to radical changes in the way food is produced and concerned. So greater resource efficiency, reduced waste, breakthrough technologies. And the operating context that they considered here is that food security could be achieved without higher agricultural production. That society rejects unsustainable production processes and consumption patterns will reduce stress on natural resources, and that there's high expectations of a circular or secular economy, and that you'll have improvements in efficiency. The other quadrant in the upper right-hand corner, New Horizons, vigorous agricultural growth, production, strong innovation is driven by new types of farming, integration of smallholders into markets. That's a big deal. The world has a lot of smallholder farmers which do not participate in commodity markets. So the operating context here is that growth is going to be fueled by innovations that expand agricultural production into unfavorable climates and perhaps onto more marginal and degraded lands. In this scenario, they considered the importance of soil carbon sequestration, getting increased recognition by society and by people involved in the environment. And here there's high expectations and requirements for efficient production processes and greatly enhanced nutrient use efficiency. The Commodity Classic, which is kind of like business as it is right now, considers vigorous agricultural production growth and weak innovation practices. It'll largely be driven by population increases and rising incomes. So this would assume, this operating context, that we're going to have infrequent extreme weather events. They'll be very localized and have a minor impact. That consumers are not going to be as concerned about regulations, and politicians aren't going to be concerned. So the NGOs are not going to be paying much attention to agriculture. There's going to be no significant increase in nutrient use efficiency or pressure for nutrient recycling. And there's going to be little environmental pressure to try and change how we farm, how we use fertilizers, and so forth. The final one, this reduced dynamism, sluggish agricultural growth, and weak innovation drivers, it's probably the most pessimistic of them all, but this considers lower population growth, decline in living standards, diminished farm profitability. In its operating context, it includes a lack of innovation solutions to address resource constraints and improve farmer profitability. No desire or I guess demand to try and improve farmer profitability. Policymakers are focused elsewhere. They're not concerned about food production. They're worried about other financial or other crises around the world. And there's no excitement about circular economies. So IFA went through this exercise, and they came up with these various scenarios, and now they're at a point where they're trying to discuss, well, what are the implications of all of these plausible futures that might take place? And they're looking to see, well, how would they adapt? If you want more information about this, you can go to the IFA website, and they've produced an executive summary of this. And I think it might be of interest to APROSEED and to many of you in this room, just to see, because a lot of their scenarios that they developed are directly applicable to all of us in agriculture. So the fertilizer industry and farmers are closely intertwined. The health of one is very closely related to the health of other. We in the industry need you as farmers to be profitable and economic, and you need the fertilizer industry to do the same, remembering that half the world's food comes from the production of fertilizer. So when you're trying to figure out, well, what does the future look like? You know, we know what the past is pretty good. We're living in the present, but what does the future look like? From a farmer's perspective, you're under a lot of pressure to produce more food, while at the same time protecting the environment. The fertilizer industry is under similar types of pressure to make sure that their products are used in an environmentally sound way. And so from our perspective, what does the future look like? From a nutrient management perspective, it's all related to 4R nutrient stewardship. Using the right source of plant nutrient at the right rate, applied at the right time and in the right place. That this is a solution to environmental concerns, it's a solution to farmer profitability, and to increasing our production around the world. And so as an institute, we've been heavily involved in developing the science for 4Rs. They're all science-based. We've developed a manual that explains the scientific principles behind 4Rs. It's available in Spanish, Portuguese, Chinese, French, Arabic, Turkish, 8 or 9 different languages. I can't remember them all. And it's being picked up all around the world. And so I know many of you, or probably all of you in this room, have heard about 4Rs. It's a concept that the government regulators can understand and that society can understand. And it can be applied to large farms here in Argentina or to a farmer in sub-Saharan Africa that is only farming a fraction of a hectare. So I'm sure most of you have heard of Abraham Lincoln. He was one of the early presidents of the United States. He said the best way to predict your future is to create it. And I think there's been a lot of discussion at this meeting about that. And Mahatma Gandhi said, the future depends on what you do today. You're here learning things, you're here actively engaged in farming, and a lot of what you do today will determine your future. So with that, I thank you for your time and your attention this morning.
Ahí está. Bueno, les decía, le agradecemos a Terry la excelente presentación y la visión un poco hacia el 2030. Y tenemos algunas preguntas que ya nos hicieron vía los mensajes. La primera es si usted cree que el sector agropecuario mundial va a tener la capacidad de satisfacer la demanda de materia prima de la población.
Could you repeat that for me? I only got a portion of it.
Agricultural sector in the worldwide would be able to satisfy the demand in production. If the agriculture worldwide will be able to satisfy the demand.
Yeah, the question is, can agriculture meet the demands, the future demands of that the society and population are going to have? I believe that they can. Right now, the world produces enough food to feed the people that we have on this earth. But we waste over 30% of the food that's produced after harvest. Some of it is lost in processing, some of it is lost in storage, some of it is wasted once it gets to the consumer plate. So if you consider the whole supply chain, you as farmers are only a component of that. We know we can increase production. We know we can reduce some of these yield gaps. And if you do that collectively with addressing the issue of waste and applying the other technologies that are available which will help increase yields beyond what we're doing right now, I think we will be able to meet all of the future food demands.
Terry, una segunda pregunta es, siempre se debate en Argentina sobre si tenemos que especializarnos en productos primarios o forzar a una industrialización. ¿Cuál es su opinión? ¿Cuál sería su opinión?
So primary products versus industrial products. I'm assuming the question has to do with adding value to what you produce as farmers here in the country. And I think there needs to be a combination of both. I think Argentine farmers need to look for ways to add more value to their product, to bring more profit to them than those that take your products, that buy the primary products, and then they develop them for various other uses. And so I would certainly hope that the entrepreneurs among you will look for ways to increase the value of the crops that you're growing rather than simply exporting soybeans in a raw form or corn.
Una tercera pregunta es acerca de qué piensa usted respecto a los fertilizantes fosforados y el desbalance mundial, en especial acerca de la falta de reposición en Argentina. He's asking that, what do you think about fertilizers and the imbalance at the world level, especially about the lack of replenishment of phosphorus in Argentina? Voy a asociar esta pregunta con otra que hay acerca de cuáles son las limitaciones en cuanto a disponibilidad de roca fosfórica a nivel mundial.
Yeah, balanced fertilization is an issue all over the world. In places like India, where they use very high rates of nitrogen relative to phosphorus or potassium, and recognizing that their soils are very deficient in potassium, that causes a big problem. It impacts their yields very negatively, and it makes their nitrogen use very inefficient. here in Argentina, you're blessed with some very rich soils. They're deficient in phosphorus, but they're very rich in potassium. They're deficient in nitrogen. They're deficient in sulfur. And so I think here in this country, you need to pay attention to balanced fertilization. That is important to do. You just can't mine nutrients from the soil indefinitely without having your soils become degraded. And so I know phosphorus is an issue here, and you certainly need to replace your phosphorus. Potassium, not so much. There's areas here in the southern cone countries that need potassium, and you need to pay attention to that when that occurs. From a global perspective, I mentioned in my talk that people are concerned about the amount of rock phosphate that is available for crop production, because rock phosphate is a finite resource. Several years ago, there was a lot of public concern that the world was running out of phosphate. And it was based on some theories which some scientists that originated out of Australia developed called peak phosphorus, where they predicted that that phosphorus supplies would follow oil demand, and that there's only so much and the world would reach a peak, and then we would run out of phosphorus and it would decline. But that theory has been proven to be incorrect. The world has right now, under current economic conditions, some 300 plus years of available rock phosphate. And rock phosphate is what is used to make MAP and DAP and triple superphosphate. But the resources and reserves of phosphate are determined by economics. That's at current prices. If prices increase, more reserves and resources are available. There's estimates that we have well over 1,000 years worth of rock phosphate in the world, but at varying price levels of when you can mine it. It's not that it's not there, it's how economic is it to produce. With a nutrient like potassium, the world has several thousand years worth of reserves of that. And so, but again, any finite resource, we need to use it efficiently. And you see a lot of interest in Europe right now about a circular economy. They want us to recycle and reuse things as much as possible. And so we have an obligation to do that, but it's not anything that you need to lose any sleep about overnight. It'll be many generations before that becomes an issue. And I don't think it'll ever become an issue because we'll have new ways and means of mining. The soil itself has an abundance of phosphorus in it. It doesn't go anywhere. It just gets recycled.
¿Qué piensa usted acerca de los subsidios en los fertilizantes en los diferentes países y cuán sustentable usted los considera que se utilicen esos subsidios para fertilizantes en los distintos países?
Yes. No, I do not think subsidies on fertilizer are sustainable. When they're applied, they need to be applied in a very smart and an intelligent way. The example that I shared with you in India, where they subsidize their nitrogen, it costs approximately $96 a ton to buy a ton of urea in India. That's much less than a third of international prices. And because of that, farmers use way too much urea, and that hurts their yields. It's causing environmental problems now, but because that subsidy has been in place for so long, it's very difficult for the government to change it. They're always trying to fine-tune it. There's examples in Africa where the highest fertilizer in the world that a farmer pays for is in Africa. It's delivered to the coast of Africa at world prices, but before it gets to the farmer, that price could triple easily. And so there's been smart subsidies applied to certain countries in Africa to try and help farmers buy fertilizer to deal with this large difference in price. And a lot of it has to do with the internal structure of the country, the logistics of moving product around. They don't have the infrastructure in place to do that. And so I think fertilizer subsidies can be effective, but they are certainly not sustainable.
Vamos a hacer una última pregunta porque creo que ya estamos un poco pasados del tiempo previsto, pero me parece que es interesante. ¿Cuál es su visión respecto al rol de la transferencia de los conocimientos generados por las universidades y organismos de investigación? ¿Es necesaria más información o más formación de los profesionales?
Yes. Professionals need more information, and they definitely need more training. We have a major problem in the world with extension services. Governments are not spending the resources on extension and technology transfer that they once did. And because of that, the industry is picking up more and more of that obligation. And so university researchers do amazing jobs developing good information and good knowledge, but they do a poor job of transferring it to the farmer. There is no incentive for a professor to spend his time working on extension. In most places in the world, that's not how they're paid. Someone else has to do that, and I think there's a role for consultants, for agronomists, for crop advisors, for the fertilizer industry, the seed industry, the herbicide industry, to fill that gap, to transfer that knowledge. It has to be a partnership. So that means that you have to work in collaboration with the universities and the researchers, and in collaboration with the government, and in collaboration with organizations such as APRISEED, which have a great role to play in transferring knowledge so that it can be used and applied. So thank you.